Welcome everybody to CUDAN Open Lab Seminar. Today we are a little shifted to the evening. We're still on Zoom, so still no drinks after that. Today is our greatest pleasure to have Tim Tangherlini, without whom I just told him we wouldn't be here, I'm pretty sure, because there was a kind of conspiracy going on, mainly co-organized by Tim at UCLA IPUM in 2016, where about 150 people met that were mostly postdoc tenure track and up, who all sort of felt some kind of identification with cultural data analytics. And it spanned the whole spectrum that we see now in this group and also in the invitees we have, from sort of hardcore cultural physics on one end to hardcore humanities, qualitative humanities, but still data analysis on the other end, and many things in between. This is not a one-dimensional spectrum, of course. And so today, Tim will talk about Pizza Party with Satan, automated methods for conspiracy theory detection in archival and social media, which for those who are not familiar with US politics, Pizza Party with Satan obviously refers to the QAnon conspiracy theory and people around, supposedly child molesting Democrat politicians that need to be overcome with fascism. Tim, probably you want to also talk a little bit about, you moved from UCLA to UC Berkeley, which is great. So you may want to give us a little catch up on there too. And so I invite everybody on our kudan.tlu.ee events page. You find some links regarding this particular work. And as always, please field your questions. Depending on how you prefer, Tim, we can sort of, we have a 2-hour time slot. And what we typically do is either follow the speaker's sort of preference. You can either have a talk and then we discuss, or you could say we can discuss anytime. We had a case where Simon Dedeo spoke where 2/3 into the talk, the discussion took off in a completely different direction, which was awesome too. So the stage is yours, and yes, we're looking forward to this great presentation.
Great, thanks, Max. Thanks for the very nice introduction. It's good to see you. It's good to see Mila, who I know from the IPM Culture Analytics group, and it's good to see all of you. It's a shame when I was in Tartu. Oh, I don't know. I can't. I have no more time reckoning. I have no idea. I was referring to this month as the other November earlier because I couldn't remember if we were in February or March, but I knew we weren't in January or December, so it was the other November. I cannot quite recall. I think it must have been. I really don't remember. Maybe it was. I don't know what. Maybe it was fall of 2020. When I was in Tartu, I was in Tartu for about a month and a half, so I just have no recollection of when it was. I think it must have been fall 2019. It must have been. And it would have been great to have been able to come on up to Tallinn to meet all of you. I know Kudan probably did not exist at that point, but it's great to see that you guys have really taken off. And I'm looking forward to learning more about the various work that you're doing there. As Max said, my name's Tim. I was at UCLA for 28 years, working in the Scandinavian department and the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, as well as in a program in folklore and mythology. And what I was really very interested in doing, and still am, is using the affordances of statistical approaches to very large corpora of humanities type data. I'll tell you a little bit about my background in folklore, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background in computational methods, and why I think those two worked so well together as I go through my talk. As I go through my talk, I think the best thing would be to just sort of interrupt me if you have questions or need clarification. I have cleverly put together a slide deck of 72 slides, so it's almost arbitrarily large, and I can go through it at such amazing speed that could probably be done in about 10 or 15 minutes, but nobody, including myself, would have the slightest idea what I was talking about. Or I can slow it down as well, and we can jump around as well. So if you want to ask questions while I'm talking, that's great. I guess it probably makes most sense, though, for me to set up the problems and our approaches. And I'm going to share my screen here. And so this is collaborative work with my colleague Vwani Roychowdhury, who I've been working with now for approximately a decade. He's a computer scientist, electrical engineer, machine learning and quantum computing specialist. So he's equally diverse in interests and approaches. And we have two really great graduate researchers, Shadi Shahsavari and Pavan Holur, who've been working with us on this project now for several years. So I want to start off because you may not be familiar with these two wonderful scandals that happened in the United States right around 2016. In 2016, the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, was implicated in a political payback operation which had caused 5 days of traffic chaos in New Jersey because he and his staff had engineered a shutdown of the George Washington Bridge, the most heavily trafficked bridge in the United States that brings all of the traffic from New Jersey into Manhattan. And this scandal, which the shutdown had actually been in 2013, but it took about 3 years for it to come out. And it came out right at the time of the 2016 presidential election, where Chris Christie was an advisor to what became the Trump thing. And so this scandal was known as the Bridgegate Scandal. As the conspirators started going to trial, WikiLeaks began leaking the hacked emails from the Democratic National Committee, which had been hacked and turns out by Russians, and were then hacked and leaked by WikiLeaks. People's clever interpretation or creative interpretation of these leaked emails centered on a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. known as Comet Ping Pong. And the stories around this, particularly that Hillary Clinton, who was a presidential candidate at the time, and John Podesta were ringleaders of a cannibalistic pedophile trafficking ring that worshipped Satan, and they used the basement of this Comet Ping Pong pizza parlor as their headquarters. This was known as Pizzagate. And this is a very crude little metric, but I like it because it shows that Pizzagate really spiked in the week of the presidential election in 2016. And Pizzagate had a blip when it first occurred back here in 2013. And then as things started to leak out, it became more and more attention was paid to it. And here is where they were really starting to look at it in the context of Christie and legal proceedings. What's interesting is that the whole scandal isn't really completed until just this past year, when there were finally some Supreme Court cases dismissing cases against one of the main conspirators in the Bridgegate conspiracy. So we're kind of distinguishing between Bridgegate, which I've misspelled up here in the title, and Pizzagate, which is a conspiracy theory, right? There's no truth behind Pizzagate. So in today's talk, I was going to give you a little folklore theory, talk very briefly about the problem of fake news, look at the connection between fake news and the folkloric genre of legend, which are stories told as true, giving you also a brief overview of Bridgegate and Pizzagate. Develop a model for the structure of legend using Danish folklore archival material as the focus. Figure out how a 3-level model gives us more information than the standard deep structure surface level phenomena 2-level model that we're all familiar with. Apply the model to Danish witchcraft and anti-vaccination narratives, and then come back to Pizzagate and also to the coronavirus conspiracy theories, and come up with a model of conspiracy and conspiracy theory. So why folklore? Well, folklore, as you all probably are aware, emerges from this productive tension between an individual and all of the groups to which they belong. And tradition then would be all of the cultural expressive forms of the groups where this person is a member. And you can think about yourself, you're probably members of all sorts of different groups, and each one of those groups has certain traditions, cultural expressive forms that they would like to have persist. And now folklore is these cultural expressive forms that circulate on and across social networks. And on these social networks, that's where we find this forum for the negotiation of cultural ideology, norms, beliefs, values, that people are constantly tugging at the edges, but the group is always trying to make cohere. So because of the repeated forms, the repeated aspect, and the individual inputs here, what happens is that folklore becomes incredibly efficient at transmitting cultural ideology. So study of folklore at population scale should give us information about the dynamics of cultural ideology, so norms, beliefs, and values. One of the things that I've looked at through my entire career are legends, which are stories told as true in a believable fashion, and are almost always mono-episodic. One thing happens in them. Rumors are kind of a hyperactive state of legend. When legend goes viral, we can call it a rumor. And they tend to thrive in low trust or low information environments, or a combination of both. Right? So if we have poor access to information, we turn to the people around us and say, what's going on? And one of these people, Milo, will say, oh, well, here's what I heard. Right? And then if we have low trust in our information sources, right? If the only information source you've got is something like Fox News, you might turn to a friend and say, well, do you know what's really going on? So in these environments, face-to-face or now social media storytelling tends to play an incredible role in how people not only receive their information, but how they use that information to negotiate their understanding of what's happening, and also to inform their own decision making about the behaviors that they are going to take in the context of, quote, what is happening. So this means that legend and rumor are actually closely related to this phenomenon that we're all aware of, which is fake news, which David Lazar characterizes fabricated information that mimics news media in content and form, but not in organizational process or intent. So it looks like news media, but it's kind of the intent of it is very different. It takes advantage of these folkloric features. It leverages fears and proposes strategies for confronting those fears, which are already in circulation in the community it targets. That's why it becomes sticky. That's why it becomes, it has the potential to go viral. So we thought that Pizzagate offered a great opportunity to explore the folkloric dimensions of fake news and viral rumors. It also allowed us to interrogate the structure of legend, rumor, and then conspiracy story complexes at internet scale. So in the study of legend, we often talk about linked legends, which form a story complex. So you often find not just one story about witches, but you'll find many, many stories about witches that are somehow or other linked, and that would be kind of a story complex. Now, just as an aside, and this was kind of important because when we're doing culture analytics, this type of work, we often don't have a ground truth against which to test our results, right? So we don't have any evaluative corpus because it's all between people. It's all being generated at the time that we're studying. There is no official Pizzagate narrative outside of the Pizzagate conversations themselves, for example. What we were looking for then was somebody else who had done similar work, and we could use their extractions as a way of testing our extractions. So at the time of Pizzagate, the New York Times made this beautiful power diagram based on the drawings of Mark Lombardi, who was really interested in diagramming the actants in a power network and the relationships that held that network together. And if you look up Lombardi, you'll see he's got all sorts of drawings of things like Watergate. And so the New York Times used that as a inspiration and created this hand-drawn graph of what was going on in Pizzagate. And so our question was, can we derive this computationally and automagically from a collection of posts on social media? And if you've seen a lot of these talks, you know that the answer somewhere in my talk, the answer will be yes, of course we can do it and we can do much better, right? That's just simply the standard form of one of these talks. So that's a meta comment about my talk, which is now a meta comment about my talk. So let's take a look at the structure of legend that I'm working with. This is derived from the discourse analysts and ethnographers William Laboff and Josh Waletsky, and then was modified by Bill Nicolaisen to fit with legends and rumors. It has six main structural components: an abstract, an orientation. Abstract is sort of doesn't necessarily need to be there. Did I ever tell you guys what happened to me and Max that time we were out looking for a gas station in the desert? Right, so that's an abstract, right? Obviously something happened when we were out there, and you're like, no. Even Max is going, no, I don't remember that. And then I would launch into the story. I said, well, this was a few years ago. We had rented a Cadillac DeVille convertible to drive to Las Vegas, right? And so I set up the orientation, the who, where, and when. And then, of course, if I'm telling you the story, something that I think is reportable must have happened. So that's often referred to as the complicating action. And one of you, perhaps Jan or Nikita, joins in and goes, whoa, no way, right? So that's an evaluation. It may or may not need to be there, but it gives emphasis to the parts of the story that you think are important. Then there's a result, something happens. And then finally there's a coda. But Max was okay. He came back and now he's here in Tartu, right? So that's the coda. So abstract, evaluation, coda don't really need to be there. These other three parts need to be there. There's a problem with this though, and that's this complicating action, because that's pretty much the whole story, and there's just one structural feature for it. So I wanted to theorize this a little bit better. It really is actually made up of two very distinct parts. There's a threat or disruption. I don't know if you're aware of the movie Ghostbusters, but it poses one of the greatest philosophical questions of the past 2 centuries. It says, when ghosts appear in the neighborhood, who are you going to call? Right? And the answer to that, of course, is going to be fundamentally ideological. Right? You cannot answer that question without taking some ideological stance. You might call a priest, you might call a minister, you might call a doctor, you might call, well, the Ghostbusters, right? And each one of them has a certain valence in the culture in which they exist, right? So you've got a threat or disruption, and it's very interesting to see what a group sees as a threat or disruption, right? If I tell you a story about a UFO landing, right, that is sort of like, whoa, that must have been really cool, unless there are UFOs landing all the time, in which case there's nothing to report. It's like, of course you saw a UFO landing. They land all the time. So it may not be seen as a disruption culture sub A, whereas in culture sub B, it's the biggest disruptive thing or the biggest threatening thing you can imagine, right? So looking at the range of possible threats tells us a lot about the people who are telling that story. And then there's a strategy for dealing with that threat, right? And so you can apply a strategy for that threat. If you've ever seen the movie The Exorcist, the threat is satanic possession, in this case, of a child, right? So what's threatened is very important. That's sort of the most important thing in our nuclear Catholic family in that film, a nuclear family that's been destroyed by divorce, and so they're obviously open to satanic threat. Reagan is possessed by the devil, which is about the worst thing that can happen. And then the strategy for dealing with it, they cycle through a whole bunch of strategies, right? The first thing she does is she gives Reagan some aspirin or Tylenol, I think. And, that's fine, except if you look at the label on your aspirin bottle or your Tylenol bottle, and you look what it's good for, satanic possession is not on the bottle. It doesn't say Tylenol reduces fever, it takes away muscle aches, right? Aspirin, but it doesn't combat Satan. They take her to the doctor. The doctor gives her some antibiotics. He gave her the wrong thing. He should have prescribed anti-satanics. That would have helped better. Takes her to the psychologist. The psychologist, whole room full of scientists can't do anything. It's not until they get to the Catholic priest in the basement of Georgetown University that they're actually able to get some traction. So there's a clear ideological component to this. She cycles through all of these different strategies, and it's finally when she hits on the Catholic strategy that the family comes back together. So what were some of the models, the relationships between structure and surface level phenomena that we can observe, right? So this was actually a question that the Russian formalists were asking as well. Prop and some of the other early Russian formalists were playing with these ideas of sujet and fabula. They were also looking at deep level structures and surface level expressions. So you could map surface level expressions, the things we could observe, to some deep level structure. And as part of their enculturation, people internalize the structure and then produce stories that conform to the structure. It's incredibly easy to apply this model, but it kind of doesn't tell you a whole lot. It's going to assume that all observed phenomena are more or less complete stories. But in the real world, people don't tell complete stories. They tell story parts, right? They might say, oh yeah, you remember that time with Mila? And Hannah might nod knowingly. And that's it. That's the only story part we get. And that can happen over and over again. So if I were to walk into a noisy bar, I would just be hearing little bits of stories from each of the tables, and I wouldn't be able to sort of sit down and join the conversation unless I knew the people at that table. Why? Because if I know the people at that table, we're kind of a clique, and we probably share all of the same information over and over again, and we can reconstruct the imminent story that we're all contributing to. I wanted to divide so that we could actually do our work. We devised a third meso level, sort of an intermediate level, binding the macro scale genre structures to the micro scale of performance, and this was the Mesoscale of Domain, inspired by the 19th century British philosopher George Boole, from whom we get Boolean logic. In every discourse, whether of the mind conversing with its own thoughts or of the individual in his intercourse with others, there is an assumed or expressed limit within which the subjects of its operation are confined. Right? So if we're sitting around at that bar, that noisy bar, and talking about Mila's UFO abduction, if Max sits down and starts talking about ironing boards, right? He's kind of out of the conversation, right? Unless there is something to do with ironing boards and her abduction, right? So there's some limit as to what can be talked about once you're talking about something in a particular domain. This, in folklore theory, is very helpful because it puts constraints on the range of allomotifs, right? The actual forms that fit into slots like the villain or the hero. And Alan Dundes calls these allomotifs, being inspired, of course, by linguistics, allomotifs to fit these motifemic slots. And it's the context in which the conversation is taking place that you get limits placed on the range of possible insertions. So threats and strategies are going to be determined by the domain. And there's going to be a range of available actants and the relationships between those actants in the domain. Now, if I can estimate what those are, I can devise a generative model. So once you know the context, the constraints, you can put together a story and join the conversation at any one of those tables in the noisy bar, right? So if I can harvest from each one of those tables in the noisy bar and then estimate what the constraints are on their storytelling, I can then sit down and do some sort of sampling of the underlying narrative framework graph, right? So the idea is that there's an underlying framework based on these constraints that takes advantage of the sort of incorporated or sort of as you become enculturated, you've internalized the structure of storytelling in your culture. Now you've got the constraints, and now you can just sample with some probability over the actants and the relationships and generate a story or story part that would be perfectly admissible in that conversation. So it looks a little bit like this. At the very deep level, you've got the tradition context. You've got, in this case, legend structure. Then we want to find out what the narrative framework is, the constraints, and how the different actants are interrelated, right? So this will give me actants, relationships, and sequence. And that basically is the motifemic slots being filled by the allomotifs. And then stories are instantiations of this narrative framework in whole or in part, which includes things like evaluation and framing, the abstract or the coda. So how does this help us? Well, we were looking at archival material, or I've been looking at archival material for a very long time. So from 19th century Denmark, I've been working with 35,000 or so legends collected from peasants throughout Denmark in the 19th century. And I took various features of these stories, and I could do things like map where witches, if there was a correlation, a population density corrected correlation between certain topics and certain phenomena. So stories about witches, once we did this, tended to show an incredible hotspot in a place called Grinneslev. And I thought that was really strange. Why Grinneslev? Because I used to bike by Grinneslev a lot. And I knew this was the extent of the town of Grinneslev. It's this old church. Well, it was the site of a well-known Augustinian monastery, Grinneslev Kloster from the 12th century. It was built near a holy spring, Breum-Kille, but was abandoned in the aftermath of the Reformation. The spring at Breum, like all things Catholic in Denmark, were later associated with witchcraft. And then in the end of the 17th century, Anna Madstad and her twin sister were burned at Breum. They were the last witches burned alive in Denmark, even though witch burning had been prohibited. After they were burned, the king in Copenhagen caught wind of this, and he wrote a very angry note to them and said, "What are you doing? You're not supposed to burn witches anymore." And the local council wrote back and said, "Oh, sorry, your email must have gone to spam." They basically didn't get the memo. Sorry. What's interesting is that very few places mention Breum in in their storytelling. It's really just that they mention places around it, and there's a strong correlation with stories that are about witches or like witches. So I was interested in what kinds of stories these were. And as I dove into that, I realized that there was a little bit more going on here, and that we were actually finding the indications of a whole series of linked narratives, which I mentioned before we used to refer to as legend complexes, and I think they actually have a lot to do with conspiracy theories, right? So this is kind of a conspiracy of witches that we're seeing in 19th century Denmark, and they happen to be clustered around old Catholic monasteries and convents. I didn't know that at the time. So here's just one of these stories and how we break it down. I was doing this work in Tartu and didn't have as good NLP tools as I would have liked. So this is a highly supervised method. So semi-automated is what I would call it. But if I extract from this, right, the various actants and their relationships, I wind up with a graph that looks like this. The witch uses powers to control animals that steal farm produce. She's also harming the farm animals and thereby harming the farmer. And in this case, the workers repel the witch using tools so that she can no longer harm the farm animals that they care for, right? And so I do this over and over again for these 3,500 legends, and I wind up with this underlying narrative framework graph for stories about witches in Denmark. And the weights on the edges are just based on some relative frequency. And then the dotted ones are inferred. It never says the minister is married to his wife, right? But we say this is the minister's wife, so I can infer that there's a relationship there. What's interesting is that I can then actually think about this in the context of different domains of interaction. And I see that I also can jump to other types of stories, right? So stories about Satan and farmers often include things like manor farms. And there's a whole other group of stories that relate minister and ministers' wives to witches through Satan. And it turns out that Satan becomes this sort of pivotal figure in a lot of these stories. A lot of the stories get aligned through that. So we started taking apart these different domains of interaction. So farm work was a normal one. And so this is what farm work looks like. There's really no story there in farm work, right? It's just this is everyday life. Witches then become another layer in this multi-layered network where and you can see the projection, farm animals to farm animals here. So we find nodes playing different roles in these different networks or domains. So the witches look like this. Then we can throw in the cunning folk who are there to kind of help out people and sometimes combat witches, but they're often in competition with witches for the health of society. We find the minister's wife, who is often a witch herself, and then we find Satan, who grants the witch her powers, and then we can actually find landowners, right? And so projection onto Satan, landowners, and now we've got farmers and workers back over here going all the way through, right? So we've got all of these different domains of interaction, and when we project them all together, we see that it becomes this one single network. So we can actually slice out the different domains of interaction and see how they're aligned, and it's the storytelling that holds all of these things together. And if I take out Satan or I take out witches, it all falls apart. So basically, this is what we come up when we do this process over and over again. So you couldn't do it just by randomly sampling. You wouldn't know if that was a good representation of the belief in witches space in Denmark in the 19th century. But by doing this, we're able to figure out all the threat agents, the objects of threats, the strategies. Because we know who told the story and where they lived, we can correlate this to classes of narrators. And we can also correlate this to political and church-based profiles where these people lived. And it also allows us to, if we were magically transported back to the 19th century, actually contribute stories to Danish tradition. So now we could actually go back in time, sit down at the local pub, and talk about Else Mikkels down the road, and people would nod knowingly, because we've now sort of estimated what it takes to be a Danish storyteller interacting with witchcraft. So these are some of the impacts of it, which I'm now exploring in my folkloric work. We can also apply this method probably with much better accuracy, with better tools, because it's all in English, to vaccine hesitancy. And this is something we did now 5 years ago. It was very clear in 2014 that a lot of people were either under-vaccinating or not vaccinating. So it's funny how our work has all of a sudden become relevant again, with vaccine hesitancy creeping in because of the fact that we're now vaccinating en masse for COVID-19. And we were interested in who was not vaccinating. What were their concerns? How were they talking to each other? And we knew that the CDC's messaging, just get vaccinated, goddammit, that was basically their message, was failing. Certain communities were like, yeah, not doing that. So again, we took a large corpus of partial conversations from social media, and we found all of the actants in that space: the parents, children, medical professionals, schools, governments, religious institutions, vaccines, vaccine-preventable diseases. Now, we were still operating under the assumption that people thought that the vaccine-preventable diseases were dangerous. But what we discovered as we started working with these stories, which were very noisy, they looked like this. A friend of my daughter got her shots for this one, and now has multiple issues: anxiety attacks, rashes, a lot of fatigue. My girl is not getting them. No way. Right? So that's a very noisy story to work with. You don't actually even know what the heck she's talking about if you were to just randomly sample that from a parenting blog. So our idea was to collect as much as we could and then extract that narrative framework that is undergirding the conversations, right? It's something that people have internalized as they come in, start reading the blogs. They internalize that. They match it to this structure that they're aware of, the threat narrative, right? Orientation, complicating action, threat, complicating action, strategy, result, and iterate through that again and again. And we can see that this graphing this is actually quite difficult, because there's an internal story and then there's a frame story, right? Parents intuitively, we infer that they want to protect their children. Vaccine causes an adverse effects which the children suffer once they receive that vaccine. And so it's the vaccine that's threatening the child. And because the vaccine is threatening the child, the parent is going to reject the vaccine. All right, so you see how that's kind of two stories rolled into one. And it's showing us she's signaling her strategy in the story. Once we did this over millions of posts, we were able to extract this underlying narrative framework that showed parents had decided that the threat was not the vaccine-preventable diseases. You see, it's not even connected to the main graph, but it was the vaccines that are the main threat. And so if the vaccine is the threat, the best strategy is to try and avoid it. And the best way to avoid it is to use an exemption so that your children can still attend school, right? So they need an exemption so that they can attend school. So they use medical professionals and they use their religious institutions to get an exemption so they can avoid the vaccine. And so that actually comes out very, very clearly over these millions and millions of posts. That what really these discussions are resting on is not that measles is really dangerous, but rather the measles vaccine is really dangerous. Well, then it's obvious. Figure out a way to avoid the measles vaccine, and the best way to do that is to get an exemption. And so then the question is, well, what can we do with this knowledge? California legislature just used a big mallet, a hammer, and they said no more exemptions. But that just made people figure out a way to an alternate strategy to avoid vaccines, right? So it was the wrong way of doing it. There probably has to be some sort of community-specific work that's culturally sensitive to make sure that as many children as possible are protected from these vaccine-preventable diseases. So now we come back to Bridgegate and Pizzagate. We used Bridgegate to model an actual political cover-up, and Pizzagate as a model of a fictitious political cover-up, right? So Pizzagate did not happen. There was no satanic, cannibalistic, pedophile ring operating in the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor. It just didn't happen. And I know what you're thinking right now. It's like, oh, yeah, no, yes, it did happen. But no, it didn't happen. And you probably have no reason to trust me. You think I'm part of the deep state. I really am not part of the deep state. Pizzagate didn't happen. Bridgegate, however, did happen. I know it happened because one of my friends was stuck on the George Washington Bridge for 36 hours. So that definitely happened. And that was an actual conspiracy. So one of the very interesting thing about conspiracies is it's a group of malign actors working in behind the scenes, deliberately trying to cover up what they're doing for either personal benefit or some sort of very clear gain, right? They've got motivation for doing this. In this case, they wanted to punish a Democratic mayor of Fort Lee, New Jersey, because he refused to endorse Chris Christie's run for governor. He's a Republican. One of the things that's really challenging about this, it's similar to the Danish 19th century folklore collections, but for many other reasons. You've got multiple narratives and stories are coexisting. There's no single document. It's scattered over millions of posts. And because it's a window into this human decision-making process, we have to understand how this forms over time. And so we basically have to define and estimate a complex generative narrative, which drives the emergence of conspiracy theories. And we're gonna look at that in the context of something like a conspiracy. What characterizes an actual conspiracy? What characterizes a conspiracy theory? So if we're just going to look at how this might be generated, a user picks a domain from a narrative graph, right? It says, oh, I'm going to talk about Pizzagate. They sample nodes and relationships from this graph, which means that they sit down and they read some posts, so they listen to a conversation. And then they're going to generate a text that connects nodes with edges. And if they do something wrong, it doesn't really matter because nobody else is going to pick up on what they're saying, right? So if somebody sort of suggests that, oh, there was also a magical talking dog in the Pizzagate graph, it's like, yeah, no, there wasn't, right? So nobody else is going to pick up on that. Right, or that James Alefantis also rode an elephant in the Barnum Bailey Circus. Nobody's going to pick up on that, so it's going to sort of sink down in the graph, and it's going to kind of disappear because nobody's activating it. Right, so the graph sort of tends to reinforce parts that have already been activated through storytelling. You choose different words or phrases for a single entity or concept. That means there's no ideal semantic encoding. That means it's very hard to figure out, Hillary Clinton could be Hillary with two L's, could be HC, could be that B Clinton, it could be BC, it could be any number of ways of encoding Hillary Clinton. Um, and then, of course, like with the witches, various actants appear in different domains. We saw that the minister appeared in a bunch of different domains. We saw farm workers appearing in all of the domains. And so that means there's a contextual representation of these different actants in the storytelling space. And so what we need to do is we need to parse at the sentence level and then aggregate via semantic encodings. So one of the questions was, are there narrative differences that we can actually discover when we do this process over millions and millions of posts? And I already had a suspicion that there were, because I'd worked with these witch stories and recognized that there were different domains being activated. And the minister's wife played different roles depending on which domain she appeared in. Same thing with the farmers. So if we recall, Pizzagate was sort of developed in Reddit. And what we did was we sort of just went through very quickly and said, what are all of the named entities in these Reddit discussions and what are their relationships? And we created what we call a wall of crazy, or a murder wall, for Pizzagate. And you're familiar with these because during COVID, if you're anything like me, you've been sitting in and streaming every single Nordic noir detective series that exists, including that one from Finland with the guy with his mental map images and stuff like that. And every single detective agency or every single police department has a wall in the back room where they've put up a whole bunch of pictures, and with red string. Even I have one. A wall of crazy. And so we did that virtually for the Pizzagate, and we wind up with this. And that looks really, really crazy, right? I mean, that's like, whoa, that's complicated. What's interesting is when we do it for Bridgegate, we get that. And so it might well be that real life is a heck of a lot more complicated than the realm of storytelling. So going back to our first challenge, could we match the New York Times graph? And remember, that was the New York Times graph. And here's what we were trying to derive a narrative graph from. And you can see that these are incredibly noisy types of posts, and they're all very short, right? So in Reddit, you get these very short bursts that you then have to see if you can extract some underlying representation. And when we did it, we found all of the things that the New York Times found, just from the Reddit posts and the other conversations online. We missed a few things. We got them later on when we refined the pipeline. But we also got a lot more stuff as well that give a much more nuanced view of what's going on in Pizzagate. So we see that John Podesta is deeply involved in Satanism. Tony Podesta has weird art that uses secret code language that promotes pedophilia, and on and on and on. So our graphs have much more detail, both on the edges and on who the different nodes are, just from extracting and doing this aggregation over the social media posts. With Bridgegate, the question was, could we match the New York Times graph? And you see we actually match it ridiculously well. But we also found out there were certain things that were very interesting about the actual conspiracy. All of the actants came from a single domain, this being New Jersey politics. Everybody was known. They had lives outside of New Jersey politics. And all the relationships for the Bridgegate material were contained within that single domain of New Jersey politics and New Jersey area transportation. And then, of course, the story emerged very slowly over time. Like I said, it happened in 2013, and the whole thing finished up in 2020. So 7 years, as opposed to Pizzagate, which was fully formed and stable within a month. So conspiracy theories tend to develop very, very quickly and then stabilize. And then the negotiation is just on sort of little things at the edges. And of course, the conspiracy theory has multiple domains at work. Yeah, so these are a couple of hypotheses that we tested. And if you look at it, we found a democratic politics domain. We found a domain about the Podesta brothers. We found a domain that I call casual dining. And then we found this weird domain of Satanism. And they are all very separate until you add in, and you can see that they're all separate when we project them into the same plane. They're all separate. But when we add WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks makes all of these connections between these otherwise separate domains. And if we project it, we see that we've got a connected component. So all of the domains have been connected through the interpretation of the people who are mining the WikiLeaks data, right? So it's an interpretive act that's placed on top of this. It's not an investigative act. So conspiracy theories are interesting because they cross multiple domains. Legends usually only cross two domains. There's a threat, and then there's the inside domain, right? So there's an outside domain disrupting or threatening the inside domain, and there's a strategy for dealing with that. Conspiracy theories bring in multiple domains. They reflect what we call monological thinking, right? They try to be totalizing in worldview, right? So anywhere you look, there's a threat, and anywhere you look, there's some ways of strategizing that. And so we found this to be characteristic of something like a conspiracy theory. So then we've moved on to these new challenges. Conspiracy in the time of Corona, which also brings us to QAnon, which is really the fulfillment in the internet age of this monological thinking, this totalizing goal of aligning all of the different domains. So if you've got a conspiracy theory A and conspiracy theory B, QAnon is going to, as the conspiracy theory, the mother of all conspiracy theories, try to align those different conspiracy theories, with each conspiracy theory being made up of a layer of different domains. So here's how this is working computationally. We capture pairwise relationships through syntax structure. We do some improvement on open information extraction tools. And then we include many types of relationships in the sentence level: subject, verb, object, subject, verb, preposition. So it's very NLP, this first part of the pipeline. We then do a ranking over the entities that we capture, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all of these different entities and aggregate them into groups so that we can reduce the space that we're working with, right? So we want to get Bill Gates, Gates, BG. We want to get them all into the same, what we call supernode. And the supernode is going to be made up of contextual mentions of what we call subnodes, right? So Bill Gates in computing, Bill Gates in philanthropy, Bill Gates at home with Melinda, right? So all of the different contexts in which we might encounter Bill Gates, those are subnodes of the supernode Gates, right? So we're going to have this multi-level representation of this very noisy space, right? So the space is incredibly noisy. So a lot of what we're doing at the very beginning is trying to figure out what the subnodes are, which are context-dependent representations of the supernode. Does that make sense? So this is kind of the thing that allowed us to get these these nice graphs. Yeah, sure, Max.
How do you separate these? Reminds a little bit of like, separating family Seinfeld from Office Seinfeld, right?
So we do this at the sentence level, right? So over time we're going to get some separation there, right? So these are different contexts.
Okay.
Okay.
And you decide what the communities are, or do they?
No, we're gonna get to community detection later on. So this is the problem. This is a very very multi-step process. Each one of them is based. There's a lot of filtering that goes on. There's a lot of thresholding, and those can be determined. You can play with those, but it fundamentally, when you get to the end, you've got fairly high confidence in the structures that you've derived. So the subnode is the same context subset of a supernode, and we derive this by using these clustering methods in BERT, right? So we do HDB scan over the BERT embeddings of phrases, right? And so what you wind up with is something like the phrase is a huge decrease in flu deaths, the regular flu deaths, 170 deaths from the flu and pneumonia deaths, influenza rate, other flu outbreaks. Those are all about death and flu, and so that becomes a subnode. And then you get something like common flu. This is from the work that we've been doing on COVID-19. This flu, seasonal flu, common flu, normal seasonal flu, weaker flu, normal flu, right? So that's a subnode of flu. The supernode is flu. But this is a subnode, which is like common flu. Another subnode would be death flu, right? But they are all part of the supernode flu. And so this is where we use these embeddings of BERT. Gets a little bit technical, and the grad students would actually be able to tell you a little bit more about how we do this. But we're taking phrases and getting their phrase embeddings, and then we're using HDB scan to cluster them, and then we can then take a ranked list of the words in each cluster, basically a frequency list, and choose top ranked words as a label for that cluster. And those clusters become subnodes, which can then be aggregated into these supernodes. Right, so we've got all these entities, we've got some sense of the supernodes, we use the word embeddings, and we get the subnodes that make up the supernodes, which actually can be overlapping, right? So it's not, it's a cover as opposed to sort of a community. And then you get these edge triplets in the final network. For each subnode pair, we aggregate the sentence level relationships. This is also hard, right? So there's another aggregation that has to happen to get things like create, patent, fund, inject, program to be a relationship group, funded, obsessed, things like that. So we want to reduce the relationship space as well. Right, so we want to reduce the entity space into these subnodes. We want to reduce relationship space. Otherwise, you just get a complete hairball. And then, finally, once we have these networks, we can run a community detection to figure out how these different narrative nucleations are connected. Right, so the social media network actually consists of numerous narrative frameworks that are bubbling up, and so we want to be able to figure out where those are. And so we run on this giant network, we run this community detection, and we actually find these narrative frameworks that form communities. So Max, here's unfortunately what the pipeline to do this looks like. And we start off here with this just cleaning, and then we do a lot of NLP stuff here, and this gives us the seeds for these actants, which gives us the supernodes. And then we do the BERT embedding to get the subnodes, and we label them. We delete certain nodes, merge, threshold, etc. And we have a significance of the supernode. And remember, the subnodes are part of the supernodes. And this gives us this first graph, which we then can refine to see which ones are, for example, threats and what they might be threatening. And then we do the community detection to find the different parts of the narrative graph. Okay, so it's exhausting to actually go through the network, through the whole pipeline. We're getting all of these pieces to be much more stable. So that's one of the things that we've been working on this past year, is getting this to actually start to move towards almost real-time implementation. So we harvest every day, and we generate new graphs every night for what's going on in the conspiracy theory space, and then we can compare with some rolling window how these narrative graphs are changing. And what we're seeing is that they're actually starting to move together. So this was maybe about 3 months ago. Conspiracy theory communities in the COVID graph, we had 30 large communities. We had conspiracy theories. We had 4 main conspiracy theories that we were identifying. There were multiple nucleations of new little conspiracies jumping up. And then there were several meta-narrative communities that were sort of like talking about COVID, right? So people talking about the various conspiracy theories, but not actually contributing to the conspiracy theories themselves. What's interesting is that in the past few months, a lot of these conspiracy theories have been collapsed into this broader QAnon umbrella conspiracy theory. So here is one of the ones that we discovered. It was very interesting to see it got infected right there by COVID-19. So that was right there in the data. And this is basically Bill Gates, 5G, and vaccinations. I don't know if any of you have had your vaccination yet, but I got a vaccination about a week ago. And as I drove past a 5G tower, I immediately had this urge to go out and buy some sort of Microsoft equipment. So luckily there was a store right there. I could pop in, I could buy some Microsoft equipment. And now my whole family is basically slaves to Bill Gates. So this story actually might be real. There's the Chinese bat story, which is kind of interesting because it has some very racist elements to it. And it sort of is related to these wet market stories. And it's basically an anti-Chinese narrative that those damn Chinese eating their pangolins that they're buying at the wet market caused this thing. There's the bioweapons story, which had become very powerful roundabout last summer, where the Chinese Communist Party had developed it as a weapon, and that China was using it as sort of, planning on using it to end the world. But there's some indication that it may have been an accident, right? So there's this, and that's actually a story that's gaining traction again over the past few weeks, that it really was a bioweapon engineered in a lab and it was accidentally released. There's still a lot of this, and if you go, I'm sure if you were to fly to Texas now, you would see that there's still a lot of people who believe that this thing is a hoax, that it really is not that threatening. From someone who actually I unfortunately had COVID that last November, I got to tell you, for a hoax, this thing is really packs quite a wallop. It really is the only hoax that I've ever experienced that gives you a fever for 3 or 4 days and makes you wonder if you will ever walk among men again. It really is quite a hoax. Very impressed that they could engineer a hoax that has those kinds of individual effects. But this led to something called Film Your Hospital, which is in some ways now also related to the vaccine hesitancy. But you see that it also brings in global warming as a hoax, right? And then we've got these nucleations, little things that are trying to get a place in the narrative sphere. And then these are all getting sort of subsumed by QAnon, which is then deeply political and related to things like Stop the Steal, which is sort of like Film Your Hospital, and has led to real-world actions, right? So one of the reasons we're interested in this is because what are the real-world impacts of this? And for the longest time, people said, well, I don't know, people talking on the internet, it's just people talking on the internet. And yes, it's just people talking on the internet until it isn't, when they appear armed and break into the U.S. Capitol and people die, right? So it's all just fun and games until somebody gets killed. So I think some of the conclusions are that our methods help identify important actants, the interactant relationships, and it can do this from very noisy data. It allows us to construct a narrative framework graph that presents a multi-scale representation of that space. We can identify context-specific threats and maybe some of the strategies. That's what we're working on right now. Where can we find threats in the graph? And what are the strategies that are being proposed to counteract those threats, right? So we're sequencing, we're trying to sequence the narrative framework so that we actually get narrative sequences. And then it might also help us find network features that determine the hallmarks of a conspiracy theory. So one of the interesting things about actual conspiracies, when we generate that graph, it's robust to deletion, right? We could actually delete everybody who was part of the conspiracy, and New Jersey politics would just continue on without really missing a beat. In fact, conspiracies are designed to be kind of invisible, lost in the thicket of those very dense connections. Conspiracy theories, by way of difference, are incredibly easy to break apart, right? If we remove the WikiLeaks, all of the edges and actants that came from WikiLeaks, the entire graph falls apart, just falls neatly apart back into casual dining, democratic politics, the Podestas and their friends, right? It's just sort of like, boop, there's nothing there. That also means it's incredibly easy to put back together, right? So while it's not robust to deletion, it's very easy to reassemble. It's a little bit like if you saw Terminator 2, where Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, may not be. Arnold Schwarzenegger is playing a good guy in Terminator 2, but where the cop is made out of that metal, so you can blow him apart, and he turns into a puddle of what looks like mercury, and then sort of just reassembles itself. That's the problem with conspiracy theories. They're sort of like that second Terminator, who no matter how much you sort of blast apart, is just going to reassemble itself, right? So they're very easy to reassemble. Whereas an actual conspiracy gets lost in the thicket. That's where they're hiding. New targets are QAnon and the attack on democracy, because conspiracy theories are not going away, right? People are like, why are you studying this? This is not really an important thing. I was like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure storytelling is a pretty important thing. And I think people make a lot of decisions based on storytelling. Think about your own life, right? You do all the research to buy a new car, and then you're at a picnic or a cookout, and somebody says, oh, you're going to buy the Volvo? I really much prefer the Lada. So like, oh, okay, I'll go out and buy a Lada. A very bad idea, actually. Or, you're in Italy, and so, oh, you're going to buy, the BMW. I much prefer the Lancia. And Lancias are horrible, beautiful, but horrible cars. And then you run out and you do that, right? So storytelling among people we trust has huge impact on the decisions we make. And so people are like, wow, conspiracy theories, they're all wacky, they're all marginal. It's like, yeah, they're all marginal until they become 75 million people and potentially can take over well-functioning democracies. They're all marginal until people start getting rounded up. They're all marginal until you are in a situation like Rwanda, where you actually have genocide. So I think the storytelling has an incredible impact on real-world behaviors, and it can be quite devastating. So QAnon, we already started following this right after Pizzagate sort of gets destroyed. So Pizzagate falls apart when Edgar Welch, a young man in North Carolina, is so upset by what he's reading on the internet that he says, and he can't understand why nobody's taking action. He grabs his rifle, jumps in his pickup truck, drives through the night, arrives in Washington, D.C. Right around early dinner time when little families are sitting in the pizza parlor eating their pizzas and playing ping pong, bursts in with his gun, shoots a couple of times into the ceiling, and says, "Take me to the cellar." Now, the problem with Comet ping pong is that there's no underground parts of Comet ping pong. It's built on concrete slab. There is no cellar. There's no cellar. But that's where the cannibalistic Satanists, led by Hillary Clinton, are trafficking the children. And so he barges around there for a while. The police arrive, and he gives up when he realizes that there's no cellar, so therefore there's no underground trafficking of children. It is reborn with the COVID lockdowns. QAnon had been kind of sort of hovering there already in 2017, so we started following it there. And you can see that Pizzagate is much more central than QAnon there, but you start to see all of these different QAnon ideas. This is a Twitter network. And then we see that a lot of these Twitter discussions are being promulgated by nodes that look an awful lot like bots. So we're looking at the internet space where QAnon really got a stranglehold. And this is basically one of these Lombardi type drawings of the relationships between entities in the QAnon space. And you can see it's every single conspiracy theory ever, and they're getting sort of linked in this QAnon universe. So we're trying to work with QAnon now as well as the COVID space. Wow, you guys didn't interrupt me too much. It's either because what I was saying was so wacky that you're like, oh my God, or you were holding all of your incredibly difficult questions now for the remaining 45 minutes. I should just keep talking so I can fill up the space so that you aren't going to ask me these, I'm sure, great and very, very difficult questions. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. No, this was great. I mean, this was totally, mesmerizing also in its coherence. There's clapping all over the audience, so I just iterate the clapping while talking about clapping. So, there have been some technical questions in the chat. Maybe we start with the content first, and I think there's a lot of things which we talked today in the research lab meeting about the necessity of pipeline design, and you gave a rather realistic pipeline of a large data science project, which is intimidating, but at the same time also interesting in itself, a kind of thing one can study, right? But on the other hand, there is a kind of, there's probably questions one could ask regarding, like, if we do this kind of filtering, right, from these granular statements or subject predicate object triplets that you find and put out, the key question is, obviously it seems to work, but the question is, what do you find? Is that something that is like naturally emerging in the data? Like, let me let me use another American metaphor. Is this evolving naturally, or is it actually a matter of intelligent design? So the kind of Pizzagate thing, for example, you say there is these simple kind of pieces that can be put together, and they're only put together by WikiLeaks, and then they fall apart and they can be put together.
Let me just jump in very quickly. They're only put together by the interpretation of WikiLeaks by these people talking about what's in the WikiLeaks data. So,
okay. Yeah. So the question is, because there's this, with QAnon, there's this thing that this looks very similar to certain style of video games. The whole thing of like conquering the sort of like public space looks a lot like Ingress, the game in geography space, where one tries to seem to cover like all sorts of things. So in a sense, do you see in this game a kind of game mechanics of conspiracy construction?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was one that I was at this wonderful unconference called Social Science Food Camp, and various people have been talking about sort of the collaborative nature of certain game spaces, and of course the fact that it is collaborative is really interesting, because in our earlier versions of thinking about conspiracy theories, it really was the lone wolf model of conspiracy theorizing. But with the internet and with social media and with huge amounts of spare time, people really enjoy these collaborative endeavors, so that it does become a bit like a game where you get a dopamine hit when somebody approves of your contribution to the ongoing development of this network graph that you might not even recognize as is a network graph. I think somewhere we've got this imminent idea of what the whole space looks like, what is admissible, what isn't admissible. And what we're trying to do with all of the conversations and the data is make visible, kind of hold up a mirror and say, this is the narrative graph that is starting to emerge from the data. And the only way we can get that is to work with these, because it's encoded in language, right? So we use these NLP methods to start to understand the relationships. What are the actants? So I use a very modified version of Elgirdis Grima's ideas of actants and interactant relationships as the kind of one of the theorizings on this. Very quickly, just there was a comment in the chat about self loops. The self loops are from SV-COP relationships, so we are trying to learn more about the individual actants. So we're just representing those as self loops, not that the actant's interacting with itself, but rather what are the descriptions about the actant in that space, so that we can tell you more about what a witch is, or more about who Hillary Clinton is and stuff like that. So that's where those self loops are coming from. So that was I knew that's always hard when you're doing network analysis and all of a sudden you've got self loops. It's like something might be wrong there, but no, those are deliberately there, because that's saying that we're getting more and more information about these, the more and more of these data points, more and more of these discussions that we're mining. So we're developing sort of a growing understanding of who these different entities are in that space. Ooh, I was not looking at the order.
I will help you a little bit. So I took a look who came first in the raising hand game.
Okay.
Yes, Vwani.
Yeah, hi Tim, thanks so much for a great talk. I have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start with a more interesting one to me. In the end, when you were speaking about the conspiracy theories, you were talking about what happens to the graph when you start to take out nodes, or when you start to try to destruct it. And I found it very interesting because in my own work with the kinematics team, we were also using social network analysis. well, actually, it's not network analysis, but for social networks. In there, we were looking at relationships between people when they work on making movies together. And we were especially interested in gender relationships. And so those graphs that we did for different countries across Europe and in Australia somewhat showed the model or the network of patriarchy, because of course so many more men were working in those networks. And they exhibited very similar tendencies. Basically, what we notice is that if you take out powerful men out of the network, it doesn't become more open for women to participate in it, but it actually builds back into its existing state. And we use different strategies to kind of try to open up those networks or try to influence them so they change shape so that they become more open for specifically women's participation. But we couldn't really find many ways. So I was wondering if I understood correctly, and this is something that you also see with these conspiracy networks, and also if you had any ideas on basically what is the underlying tendency, why do such networks appear? What is the reason behind it that we have these networks where they basically build back up after you try to remove parts of them?
Yeah, oh, those are real great questions. I wish I had an obvious answer. It's like, oh, well, you just have to go to this menu and, select this feature and push this button. But no, so understanding the separating sets in networks is very interesting. So not only that they exist, but what is constitutive of those separating sets, right? So separating sets are where I can often break a network, and it may be edges, it may be nodes, it may be some small collection of nodes and edges. We find for the conspiracy theories, what's happening is that there are these interpretive, highly creative interpretations of resources, and it may be either some resources that the conspiracy theorists say that they have special access to. That's the whole premise of QAnon. Or the conspiracy theorists have a special interpretive community that's able to make sense of something, and that's also partly what Pizzagate was based on. Certainly, what QAnon is based on, right? It's like, oh, we've been, do you take the red pill or do you take the blue pill, right? Go down the rabbit hole, as it were. And so if we can then understand what those edges are that they're bringing, then we can understand how casual dining can be connected to cannibalistic, satanic child trafficking. Because otherwise, those are very different things. How this would work, I think it really is. It's going to work differently for different domains. So it would be discovering those separating sets. Then instead of just saying, "Oh, that's a separating set," trying to understand what the features of those separating what the features are of those nodes and edges in the separating set are. I think will tell you a lot about the topology of the network that you're working with. Right, so these are kind of topological features. It's not enough just to break the network, but to try and understand why you can break the network there.
Andres.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very interesting talk. So I was wondering, I guess this is probably something you've thought about. So, like, how generalizable are these sort of findings? So you compared a few sort of networks of different sort of stories. So the Bridgegate versus the Bridgegate versus the new stuff. But despite being like sort of some complex networks, these are just in a way like singular examples. So this, and this, basically. So that's like three things. How much do you think you can generalize to like conspiracy theories as a whole?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, right now we did it for I've been working with stories about witches and these complexes of witches from the 19th century, and I was like, oh, this actually works really well. Once I take out Satan as a threat, then witches become less important. The whole thing falls apart in early 20th century Denmark, and that's why we don't really have any meaningful and worries about witches and cunning folks. So I'm trying to figure out what the mechanisms are that make the whole witch complex fall apart in early 20th century Denmark, and I think that would probably be applicable to many agricultural communities and their beliefs in witches. What's interesting is that, for example, the Pizzagate one, when we take out WikiLeaks or these creative interpretations of WikiLeaks, it falls apart and it can be put back together. We're seeing the same thing in the COVID conspiracies, right? That there's certain edges and nodes that are being drawn to draw together these narrative frameworks that otherwise would be separate, right? The Film Your Hospital, the hoax one, is very different than the bioweapon one, but weirdly they're being drawn together. It's both a hoax and a bioweapon. I mean, this is sort of cognitive dissonance that conspiracy theorists are masters of keeping going. So we're trying to increase the number of ones that we're working with. The problem is that the speed with which we're getting hit with more and more data kind of overwhelms our small group of 4 people. So there's plenty of room for more people to jump in and actually see, is this a generalizable model, or is this just something we stumbled upon? Maybe there's a class of conspiracy theories that are based on creative interpretation of either inaccessible, data, knowledge, or only accessible to some small group. But actually, if you start to think about it, it's sort of like, yeah, that kind of seems to be part of the definition of conspiracy theory. So we don't want to be chasing our own tail, but it seems to me that the hypothesis is this should be generalizable, right? That a conspiracy theory is characterized by the alignment of multiple domains through the creative interpretation of some knowledge that's either in limited circulation or is being interpreted in this new clever way by the conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, so I guess that's sort of what my question was aiming at, the sort of classes. So what you're analyzing here is like this class of like this most widespread conspiracy theories, which makes sense because then you have data. But I'm wondering, like, are these behaviors necessarily the same in like this class of like very high profile, widespread, almost global theories versus like small, more fringe kind of theories? This is what I guess I can quite phrase it this way.
That's a wonderful research question. I don't, we've got the tool now to address it.
I have a follow-up question to clarify this. So in your Danish example, I assume you have some sort of corpus where you can have sort of an idea of like how much there is. I mean, obviously with QAnon and the internet, it's like basically, control A, all of the internet, right? Or all of the World Wide Web. But these kind of methods, they're sort of seem to resonate very well with sort of old school method where the corpus is rather limited, like the Gilgamesh epos or the study of the story of the flood, where you have these kind of things of where the story is sort of told differently in different areas, and if you like superimpose them as you superimpose them, you get a kind of consensus story. And that actually happened over time. Like people would then do a consensus story and like put it into the Bible or something like that. And so you have this kind of two things of like, one is the superimposition and syncretism, and then on the other hand you have the sort of like the radiation going on, like where there's many different stories emerging from one thing. Do you see similar kind of things going on? Because this kind of thing, like you seem to create artificial clauses in a process that's highly dynamic, and there may be multiple clauses going on at the same time. For example, it's like how do you?
And so then you have to remember sort of Boole's suggestion that, you know, within any domain of discourse, there are going to be these limits. And while there might be sort of attempts to sort of expand the limits, the group is very conservative, right? And so your story, you can say whatever you want, but if it doesn't get any traction, it's going to sort of fall out of that consensus graph, right? So in some ways, we've got a consensus graph there.
Yes.
And if you want to be, you know, a storyteller that people listen to, right, you better be activating things that at least people recognize, right? So if you try to introduce something that's too innovative, it either becomes its own nucleation and may or may not get picked up, right? It may or may not, quote, go viral. But if it doesn't go viral, it falls out of the narrative graph, this consensus graph.
Nice, this is great. Mila.
I think Mar was before me.
Ah, Mar, yes, sorry. But Mar just lowered the hand. That's the reason I called Mila.
Okay, yeah.
But Mar, go on. Sorry, Mar didn't.
Yeah, it's fine. I had this question about if you had looked about if the result of the conspiracy theories is about the social media itself, like you mentioned this dopamine. That's what I was actually thinking. This the timelines being designed for being addicted, and that you are trapped there, like endless loops of getting tweets and messages in the social media, and then if you enter in the loop of the conspiracy theories and they think that you like it, they actually feed you with everything, the full pack. Actually,
you should see my Facebook feed at this point.
Wait a minute. Before the kind of the last travel kind of okay I did was in Canada before the closing of everything almost, and I had this. I was in this talk with people of I think it's called Flip Book. This kind of news app that is in iOS like became popular. And I was with the machine learning team, and they told me, yeah, I mean, actually the suggestion mechanisms we use is not so complicated. Whenever you like cats, we feed with cat news all the time, and whenever you like, now we're talking about conspiracy theories. I mean, whenever they catalog in certain kind of latent space place where there is this kind of news, I guess they bombard you with all these kind of things. I mean, I think the platforms, I think they have some kind of accountability, or they should have, on kind of disseminating all this, no? Had you?
Oh yeah, no, you raised some very good issues, and ones that I think our work can perhaps contribute to pointing out the urgency of this matter, right? So when people take action based on, you know, QAnon, and actually gather in Washington, D.C., and then actually march and break into the place and plan on, you know, assassinating political leaders, we've gone pretty far to the dark side. And this is all based in part on some of the things that the social media space doesn't have. If we're sitting around at a bar and we're talking about this stuff, there's some very clear social breaks and signaling, kinesthetic dimensions of sitting around with your friends at the bar and like, Max, you know, that's very funny, but, you know, don't do that, right? So that there's social breaks in the face-to-face world that preclude or greatly reduce the things that happen in the online world. The other thing with the online world is kind of the magnitude and speed, so sort of the velocity of this is very different than in the face-to-face real-world communities where our brains have, you know, kind of evolved, right? So we're not, and it's also very sort of, it gives you the illusion of community, without all of the components of actual real world community, all of those other components that we are aware of at the sort of lower psychological levels as growing up in community, right? The enculturation elements. So there's sort of a short circuiting, I think, and this is where kind of the dopamine hits that you're talking about come from. If I'm writing online,
can you extend on this a little bit before we all agree it's social media? You know, Donald Trump was the owner of the World Wrestling Fund, right, or something like that.
Oh yeah, it's not just social media. It's
he copied Triumph of the Will in his last speech. There's a lot of physicality, a lot of actually direct presence of people on there in all these Trump rallies. There is all this preaching of fundamentalist, so-called Christian evangelists. There's a lot of real person meets real person thing going on.
Oh, there's definitely that element of it as well, and then there's also the fact that the social breaks aren't there, right? So there's an encouragement of that. But what's interesting is that the rallies, only recently started to spill over into actual violent action. So maybe that's part of this threat narrative, right? So what is the threat? Well, the threat is to our democracy. Somebody stole all the votes. Let's go and march on those people who stole our democracy. And so I'm not discounting that, but the sort of the reach and the fervor gets compounded in this online space, and it might reach more people who otherwise would not be, quote, reachable. And then they're encouraged to take real world action and go to one of these rallies, and now they're in that space that's reinforcing.
Mila.
Yeah, actually, my question goes pretty much along the same lines as with Andre's question, but I still want to ask, because I think that this question of how these stories change and what makes them to change is very interesting. You, in a way, you describe that some of these stories are somehow changing, maybe simplifying. Is that what you're saying? And are there certain ways that, or certain kinds of structures, for instance, that make the stories to change in the future? Have you seen something like that? And also kind of like, if we look at like new stories emerging, if there are some new things happening and people start to create new stories, do you think that they would follow the similar rules as the older stories, or do you think that the new stories have kind of like form their own structures?
So that's where this 3-level model becomes very, very powerful, right? Because the underlying sort of structure of these threat narratives is something that we've internalized through our lives, and it certainly holds true for most sort of European Western societies. It also holds true for most Asian societies, because I do a lot of work in Asia, and I'm pretty sure it's as close to something that we would call universal, even without having to use the word universal. This idea that we're an inside group, there are threats to our security of our inside group, whatever those threats might be, and we develop strategies for repelling those threats, and then there's some result, which is an evaluation, a ranking of how well strategy A worked for threat sub 1, right? So it's sort of the threat narrative thing. That's a very, interesting model, but it's a deep level model. It's in the contexts, or what are the contexts in which these things appear in my society? And so there are new contexts being added and old contexts being abandoned, right? So the witch context, right, the type of threats that witches pose to the successful farming of my land has dropped out, right? We're not telling a whole lot of stories about milk hares stealing my milk. That was an actual worry in 19th and early 20th century Denmark, because my cows were dying and my milk wasn't consistent, and now I'm going to die because I don't have anything to sell to the dairy cooperative, and that really sucks. I'm definitely losing my farm, and I'm probably now going to die. So that's a actual physical real world threat. So I'm worried about it. There just aren't farmers in Denmark worried about that anymore. So that kind of thing has dropped out. What are they worried about now? Well, they're worried about immigrants, right? For example, in parts of Jutland. Right? So it's like, I'm not 100% sure why you're worried about immigrants. Well, they're going to, threaten our, quote, way of life, right? And so now they're taking collaborative action against that. So the threats have changed, and the strategies for dealing with threats change. What we're seeing in the social media space with something like COVID, here is a new threat. Well, it's not really a new threat, it's a disease. Oh, it's actually linked to, here it's linked to the Chinese. Well, the Chinese have been a threat. How do we deal with the Chinese? Why are they threatening us? And then what kind of actions? And then a new story, a new nucleation of stories kind of appears, and it either gets linked up with existing stories, or, it sort of organically starts to find linkages with other stories. Why? Because then your story is getting more, right? It might be there's some sort of evolutionary things. Good stories want to survive, so they link up with other stories that have already got big followings, or they get pulled together by some meta narrative construct like QAnon that is trying to come up with a monological model of how the world works. So those are also things that we see in our daily data dumps. We start to see, this thing was disconnected before. Now it's been hooked up with this other narrative framework. So we're seeing that as well. So this is kind of like a real world laboratory on what happens with narratives now that we can see them despite the incredible noise of these conversations. This is like the most noisy data that I've ever worked with. It's completely insane. It's total nuts. It is completely, and I'm sure there's also bias in it. Bias is kind of, we know that this is a biased field, so we're like, yeah, we recognize that there's definitely bias in this, but noise is really hard to work with.
So this is an interesting thing to think about, right? Because the question is like, what doing then? Like, what is the consequence of this? I was always mesmerized by, there's this thing in the library where I grew up, which is called the Handbuch des Deutschen Aberglaubens, which means Handbook of German Superstition, which has 10 volumes and is really big. So if you follow through,
it's here on my, yeah.
Exactly. So nice. That's like there's a supreme nerd test which tests things like having books like these in like within arm's reach.
Yeah. No, I use it I use it constantly. Yes.
So the key thing about this is like basically if you do these, like drawing your network pictures, you may end up with like the 21st century version of the Handbook of German Superstition, but then we still have German superstition, and so there's still conspiracy theories. And
people are like, that's just superstition. It's like, yeah, that just superstition is causing tens of thousands of deaths across the world right now.
So that's exactly the question. What is the action? Like once we have all this, like what do we do? Like just now we know why we all gonna die, or can we?
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's like, that's reassuring. Now, at least I know why I'm dying. What do we do? I think it's not one thing that we do. I think we do a bunch of things. In some ways, what we've done with this kind of AI approach is we're holding up a mirror to society and saying, "Here's what's going on. Do we like what we see?" And it then has to be a multi-pronged approach, right? It has to go all the way to education. How do we understand what these stories are that we live our life by. How do we understand how they can impact not only our decision making but other people's decision making? And then how can we tailor messages when we see strategies that are emerging that have the potential for really really destructive behavior or really violent behavior, so that either we can alert people to, hey, better watch out, this could be coming down the pipeline, but also to the people who are caught in these narrative traps to, you know, offer alternatives without getting into social engineering. So ethically, there's basically a minefield, and honestly, I think if one inserts oneself into this conversation, there's almost no way that you come out unscathed, as you know, there's a potential for. I mean, we basically reverse engineered a troll farm here. We could sit here and generate conspiracy theories that would now have you know, significant possibility of getting sort of picked up. And so the recognition that this must already be going on, if either automatically or organically, we recognize that we all live in a storytelling environment, for better or worse, right? Not all stories are bad. A lot of stories give us a great deal of comfort and give us a great deal of understanding of how the world works. I'm not. I don't think, you know me, Max. I'm a bearer of very little intelligence. I don't know the answer to this. This is a hard problem, and I think at least we're taking the first step to recognizing that this is, you know, how so many decisions are being made is on the basis of stories, of narratives that may, in some cases, be filled with faulty or deliberately misleading information. How do you, what are some of the ideas that you guys have been thinking about this too? What are some of the ideas that have bubbled up here at CUDAN that might help us address some of these very difficult questions?
I mean, that in general, I think that's a very good question. In general, we're in the same stage as you. Basically, one of the key questions is understand the phenomenon first, right? What is actually happening? How is this developing? What are the underlying mechanisms of how this is actually created? But obviously, there is things which one has to take account. As you say, we're maybe not the fastest one in coming up with analysis like this. There's other people who have done this in the 90s, and have done very successful hedge funds.
Yeah, no, exactly. And they monetized it.
And there's close overlap to the people who fund what's going on, right? So the question is, for example, how much of the noise is actually just noise and how much of the noise is induced? I think that is an interesting question one could actually ask. Like, is the noise actually actively risen in the system? Which, you know, let's just think about like all the rhetoric of Fox News and all the rhetoric of Trump and so on. There's obviously there's a constant spread of.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that's noise. I think it's a very interesting signal there, right?
There's a signal that resembles noise, isn't it? So
it resembles noise, but it actually probably is not noise. And then, you know, that's kind of what we've been pulling out of this. But then there is actual noise, which is sort of like, you know, spam and images and but even some of those are maybe not noise. That's kind of a really interesting question. What is noise and what's not noise? And then you can ask, you know, the motivations of this, right? So with conspiracies, right, there was very clear motivation as to why conspirators are doing what they're doing and why they don't want anyone to know. Often it's illegal, and often it's to the benefit of them or a very small group of people around them, right? And conspiracy theorists are, they're trying to generate a narrative that explains the world, right? And one of the things I'm very interested in is there isn't any clear motivation for the actants that they suggest are doing things for doing the things that they're doing. Like, why the hell is Bill Gates at all interested in injecting chips into our bloodstream that he can activate with 5G, right? The final question is, why the hell would anybody do this, right? It seems very, very complicated, and it seems to involve an awful lot of people, so many people, right, that it's almost inconceivable that we wouldn't know about this. Like, well, now you know about it. Whereas a real conspiracy has no intention of you ever knowing about it, right? All the successful conspiracies we don't actually know about.
So how do you see, this is another question I have, obviously in Europe we have our own issues with right-wing.
Europe is like perfectly harmonious, wonderful land where everybody
exactly
sings on the meadows, and
exactly,
isn't it? I mean, that's the way I see
I mean, it's Hungary, right? And every country has their right-wing kind of party in different states of rise. But if you've done this work through the last couple of years, where you say, okay, education would be important. How do you do this when your education secretary is Betsy DeVos? Is that like, how do you actually operate in such a situation?
So that's exactly why we keep running into these walls. It's sort of like, how do you do this ethically and in a meaningful way, and that doesn't suggest that there's a right, there's something that's right and that there's something that's wrong, but rather alerts people to the fact that, hey, the stories that you're embedded in are not always innocuous, right? So a self-awareness is probably the first step. But how do you get an 8-year-old kid to start recognizing this? Because they're also deeply embedded in this space.
Yes.
I have no answer to this one. Do any of you guys have an answer? How do we address this? Or do we just, as researchers, say, hey, check out what we found, this is pretty cool?
That's your big chance.
I can chime in this because, I mean, I am from Spain, and I am Catalan, actually. And I don't know if you follow the news, but we have all previous government in the jail right now. And today in the European Parliament, they are discussing this afternoon if they take out the immunity of Carles Puigdemont, that used to be our president of Catalonia. And this is a case where actually the truth is very problematic. Like when they actually check the papers of why they put all these people in the jail, Carles Puigdemont in Germany was actually released. And actually he was wiretapping in his car from the Secret Services going from Finland down to Sweden, down to Denmark. And that's in theory illegal, that the Secret Service, they operated in all these countries along. And now they are they're EU members, EU representative in the parliament, and they're trying to take out the immunity with, for example, ground truth that they did corruption because they used the public schools for doing the referendum that was not approved by the central government, but was actually was done by the elected people on the parliament. And now with the last elections, we got the majority of votes independentist, and they are just like bearing on the facts. And the facts are that we are now more than 51% that want to be independent, and they don't allow us to do a referendum. And And in my personal, I mean, some people in the group know, my cousin is charged on being a terrorist, which she's not. Because now they want to make fear to people, and they actually charge, I don't want to say wrong, but I think it's 5 guys that they all are fathers. What a coincidence that everyone is father. And unfortunately, my cousin, she had an affair with one of them, and now also is charged of terrorism. Which there was no single bomb make it in Catalonia. That was the Basques. They were actually, like when it was a democracy, they basically, the Catalans, we had also a terrorist group, and we stopped it. And the truth is that actually, maybe soon, it will be charged. Felipe González used to be a prime minister, that actually, because CIA released papers, like the American Secret Services, that he did actually a terrorist group that was Grapo, that was made by the government on the 80s in Spain to kill terrorists in the from the Basque Country. We actually they kill it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you're describing here is actually a conspiracy that has finally started through investigative journalism and the like to come out, right? And then you've got these sort of narratives and counter narratives, and that's a very interesting space.
I mean, what I'm saying is that the truth that they're selling in some moments, it's not the truth. Like it's
no, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and so that's actually what I mean by the power of stories to convince large numbers of people to perceive the world in one way that may not actually be grounded in truth at all. And so, how can we address this both in the specific cases, which just is horrifying and harkens back to Franco, really, and how can we address it in sort of general cases? I don't have any answer to this. How do we interrupt?
I mean, I don't have to, but I mean, for example, I know that there are actually the state of the state are also playing on this kind of like truth, like the same similar to the conspiracy theories they're doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, they're basically creating these narratives that are proposing some links based on the interpretation of some hidden knowledge that only they have access to, and it's part actually. So they're using a conspiracy as actual part of an underlying conspiracy. I mean, I think that's horrifying, but also fascinating. Right? So to use a conspiracy theory within your actual conspiracy.
So thank you very much. It's 7:30 in Tallinn.
Oh, right. You guys have been very patient and wonderful questions. And I'm sorry I couldn't answer the last question, which is sort of the real important one.
So basically, there would be another hour we could discuss, or another 3 hours we could discuss. So this was very, 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 very interesting. And I think this is totally something that is very inspiring for many of us. And hopefully can help save the world, or at least tell us why we will all die.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, it's the latter thing.
So with that, I would like to thank everybody for being here.
Thank you so much. It was really fun
Tim for doing this. There's again lots of clapping going on. So also, it's Happy International Women's Day. Thank you very much to all the women in the world.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you all for your great conversation. I'll come swing by Tallinn once we're all vaccinated.
Yes, of course, you're invited.
We're all safe.
Exactly. We find out all the rumors and all the legends and all the neat little things we can stack on top of each other to come up with awesome stories.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.